What if the most dangerous weapons factory in the Middle East wasn't hidden in a remote desert, wasn't buried under a mountain, and wasn't concealed in some fortified military compound, but was sitting 2 miles from a school, a bakery, and thousands of apartment buildings in the middle of a city of 9 million people? That is not a hypothetical. That is what American and Israeli intelligence discovered about Tehran's missile production network. And what they did about it has changed the rules of modern warfare in ways that every government on Earth is now quietly studying. If stories like this, the ones buried under the noise of daily headlines, the ones that actually explain how power works and why wars unfold the way they do, are what you come here for, then subscribe right now and hit the bell. Like this video if you want more analysis at this depth. And share it with one person who still thinks Iran's missile program is hidden somewhere far away in the mountains. Because I promise you, after the next few minutes, that image will be permanently replaced by something far more unsettling. Let's get into it. To understand why this story matters so much, you need to start with a simple picture of Tehran itself. This is not a military city. It is a sprawling, densely populated capital of roughly 9 million people. Traffic-choked streets lined with bakeries and coffee shops. Apartment blocks stacked against each other in every direction. Families living ordinary lives in close quarters the way families do in any major city anywhere in the world. Schools, markets, parks. The kind of urban density that makes any military planner pause before considering a strike anywhere near it. For decades, the assumption held by most outside observers, including many in the intelligence community, was that Iran kept its most sensitive weapons infrastructure well away from all of that. The thinking was logical on its surface. Iran would want to protect its most important military assets from attack, and the safest way to do that would be distance. Remote mountain valleys, desert compounds, fortified underground sites far from civilian populations, where a strike would minimize political fallout and moral controversy. That assumption was wrong, profoundly, consequentially, and it turned out historically wrong. Iran did not hide its missile production program away from its people. It hid the program among them, deliberately, systematically. Over a period of roughly 30 years, solid fuel manufacturing plants, chemical processing facilities, component workshops, and research campuses were built directly into Tehran's industrial districts, disguised as ordinary factories. Positioned inside a city, Iran was confident no adversary would ever be willing to strike, because the political and moral cost of hitting targets surrounded by millions of civilians would always be too high. For 3 decades, that confidence was justified. The factories kept operating, the program kept expanding, and the city kept going about its life, with most people having no idea what was being produced behind the walls of certain unremarkable industrial buildings, a short drive from where their children went to school. Then a war began, and the calculation that had protected those factories for 30 years stopped working almost overnight. The conflict that exposed this network opened with an event that shocked the region and redefined the rules of engagement instantly. The United States and Israel executed a coordinated strike that killed Iran's supreme leader inside his own compound, a direct decapitation of the regime's command structure at the very top of the hierarchy. Iran responded within hours with waves of ballistic missiles aimed at Israeli cities and American military installations across the Gulf. The missiles flew. And in the immediate aftermath of those launches, 2 questions became the most urgent military intelligence priorities of the entire conflict. Where are these missiles coming from? And how quickly can Iran build more? Those questions moved Iran's missile production network to the very top of the target list within the opening days of the fighting. And what American and Israeli intelligence already knew, what they had apparently spent years quietly assembling, turned out to be far more detailed and far more precise than anyone outside those intelligence agencies had understood. The Israeli military's Persian language communication channel announced strikes on multiple facilities operated by the Revolutionary Guard directly inside Tehran. Not near Tehran, not on the outskirts of the broader metropolitan area, inside the city itself. The first announced target was a missile production site in the Kojer district, a location used to manufacture components for both surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missile systems. Near it sat the Revolutionary Guard's primary center for producing solid rocket fuel, the propellant that gives a ballistic missile the raw power to travel hundreds of kilometers and arrive at a target on the other side of a border. And alongside that, a chemical manufacturing plant producing components and fuel for the same family of missile systems. 3 separate facilities. Not in a desert, not in a mountain valley. In industrial pockets of a city that the international community had watched for decades without fully understanding what was operating inside it. But here's the detail that tells you more than any single strike report. Before hitting those industrial zones, the Israeli military issued public warnings to specific neighborhoods in Tehran, not vague alerts about the city in general, but named districts, specific areas identified by name, told to evacuate because military targets were located inside them. Think about what that single fact reveals. It means that before the first strike happened, intelligence services had already mapped Iran's missile production network with enough precision to know exactly which buildings and which neighborhoods needed to be hit. They knew the district names. They knew the specific industrial blocks. They knew the layout well enough to warn civilians in the immediately surrounding areas while preparing to strike the facilities themselves. That level of precision doesn't come from a single intelligence breakthrough. It comes from years, almost certainly more than a decade, of patient, methodical accumulation of information. Satellite imagery, financial records, supply chain analysis, personnel tracking, signals intelligence, human sources, all of it slowly assembled into a target map detailed enough to strike with confidence inside one of the most densely populated cities in the Middle East. The decision to actually use that target map, to strike facilities embedded among civilian infrastructure in a capital city of 9 million people, was not made lightly. It was made because both governments concluded that the value of destroying Iran's missile production capability outweighed every other consideration. That conclusion tells you something important about how seriously they assessed the threat those factories represented. Let's zoom out and look at the full architecture of what Iran actually built, because understanding the scope of the network makes the intelligence achievement and the military operation that followed far more comprehensible. The most significant single node in the network was the Shahid Hemet complex, located on the outskirts of Tehran, close enough to be functionally part of the greater metropolitan area. This was not a facility built quickly in response to some immediate threat. It was built patiently, expanded methodically, and continuously invested in over a period that stretched from the 1990s all the way to the present conflict. It was surrounded by other industrial facilities, the kind of visual noise that makes satellite analysis genuinely difficult, positioned so that it would blend into the broader industrial landscape of the region, rather than standing out as an obvious military installation. Records going back to 1997, nearly 3 decades before the strikes, showed that a Russian aerospace research institution had already signed contracts to help build a wind tunnel at Shahid Hemat and to provide software helping Iranian engineers model missile performance more precisely. Foreign technical expertise was flowing into this facility almost from its beginning. Researchers and specialists from abroad were reportedly brought in over the years that followed to work alongside Iranian scientists. By the time American and Israeli aircraft struck it in 2026, they were not destroying a young program in its early stages. They were destroying the accumulated product of nearly 30 years of continuous development, foreign technical assistance, and systematic expansion. That timeline deserves a moment of genuine reflection. Sanctions were in place throughout most of that period. International observers knew Iran had a missile program. Intelligence satellites were passing overhead on regular schedules. And still, for 3 decades, Shahid Hemat kept growing, protected less by any physical barrier and more by the straightforward fact that it was hidden inside a city that nobody was willing to strike. Iran did not build a single massive centralized facility that would make an obvious target. It deliberately spread its missile production across multiple locations in and around Tehran: the Koja Production Center, the chemical facility servicing both surface-to-surface and surface-to-air systems, the Istaglal Industrial Zone, the Hakimiye Industrial Zone, each one hosting separate Revolutionary Guard manufacturing operations, each one embedded among ordinary commercial buildings, each one designed so that if any individual site were discovered and destroyed, the rest of the network could continue functioning. This was a resilient strategy built on dispersal, and for 3 decades, it worked exactly as designed. Pause for a second, because if this is hitting differently than the coverage you've seen elsewhere, I want to know. Drop a comment right now telling me. Before watching this video, did you know Iran was manufacturing ballistic missile fuel inside the industrial districts of its own capital, within a short drive of residential neighborhoods and apartment blocks? Yes or no? I read every comment. And if this is giving you a framework for this conflict that you haven't found anywhere else, this is the moment to subscribe. Because what's coming next in this region is going to move fast, and you're going to want this channel in your feed when it does. Let's talk about what destroying this network actually accomplishes. Because honest analysis requires being precise about both what these strikes achieved and what they didn't. Iran had already stockpiled propellant before this campaign began. It had already built missiles sitting ready to fire. Destroying production facilities does not empty those existing stockpiles. The missiles that were already manufactured and already fueled remained operational threats. What the strikes destroyed was the pipeline, the industrial ecosystem that would have replenished that stockpile as it was used, that would have produced the next generation of systems beyond what already existed, and that would have expanded the program's capacity going forward. To understand why cutting that pipeline matters so much, it helps to think clearly about what a ballistic missile actually is. Strip away the technical language, and a ballistic missile is really 3 things working together: a structural body that can survive the stresses of launch and flight, a guidance and targeting system that determines where it goes, and a propellant the fuel that generates the thrust to carry the weapon hundreds or even thousands of kilometers toward its target. You can have warheads in storage and missile shells sitting ready, but without a functioning production pipeline, generating solid rocket fuel and precision guidance components, your arsenal becomes a fixed, shrinking number rather than a renewable force. Every missile fired draws down an inventory that can no longer be refilled at the rate it once was. The practical effect of these strikes doesn't fully materialize in the first news cycle. It materializes over the following months as Iran's operational capacity to sustain a missile campaign degrades faster than it can be rebuilt. The Kojir military complex alone, based on satellite imagery reviewed by independent analysts in the weeks following the initial strikes, showed dozens of structures destroyed or severely damaged across the sprawling site. This was not a symbolic strike aimed at sending a message. Satellite imagery showing dozens of structures reduced to rubble at one of Iran's primary hubs for missile development represents the physical dismantling of a production ecosystem that took the better part of 3 decades to build. And the campaign extended beyond the factories themselves into the surrounding architecture that made the entire missile program possible. Strikes were reported on the Malik Ashtar facility, tied to one of Iran's most important military research and engineering training institutions, the place where many of the country's most advanced weapons engineers received their technical education. Strikes against the Iranian Army Air Force headquarters in eastern Tehran hit the command structures coordinating the military operations that gave those missiles their targeting and deployment logic. Piece by piece, not just the factories where missiles were built, but the institutions training the next generation of engineers who would design them, and the command centers directing how they were used. An entire ecosystem was being systematically targeted. This is what a comprehensive campaign against a weapons program actually looks like. Not a single dramatic strike that eliminates a threat overnight, but a sustained, sequenced operation targeting every layer of the system simultaneously. The engineering talent, the production capacity, the command and control, the supply chains. Remove enough layers at once, and the remaining structure can no longer function as an integrated system, even if individual pieces survive. Now let's talk about what this reveals about the intelligence operation behind it. Because the military strikes were only the visible, dramatic final step of a process that had almost certainly been running quietly for years. Iran did not rely on secrecy alone to protect its missile program. It relied on ambiguity. A missile propellant plant does not announce itself with a sign out front. From above, it looks remarkably similar to any other chemical processing facility in any industrial district anywhere in the world. The same equipment, the same building configurations, the same patterns of vehicle traffic and shift schedules. The visual camouflage was so effective precisely because it required no physical disguise. It simply used the existing landscape of ordinary industrial activity as cover. Piercing that camouflage required more than satellite passes. It required years of painstaking analytical work tracing financial records, supply chains, personnel movements, and the web of front companies and subsidiaries Iran constructed specifically to obscure what each facility actually produced. Every contract with a foreign supplier, every shipment of specialized equipment that didn't quite match its stated purpose, every engineer who moved between institutions, every procurement that suggested a capability inconsistent with declared civilian activities, each one left a trace somewhere. Assembling those traces into a usable, precise, legally and militarily defensible target list is exactly the kind of slow, patient work that never generates headlines on its own. It produces single data points, individual pieces of a puzzle, one small confirmed connection between a front company and a procurement network, one movement of a specialist with a background in propellant chemistry to an institution with no obvious reason to employ that expertise. None of that is dramatic. None of it gets published in real time. It accumulates in classified files over years, slowly building from fragments into a picture, from a picture into a map, and from a map into the kind of precise target list that allows military planners to name specific districts in a capital city of 9 million people before issuing civilian evacuation warnings. The strikes that became world news were the last 30 seconds of a film that had been shooting for years without an audience. Consider the discipline that kind of work requires over that kind of timeline. Analysts returning to the same files year after year, tracking small changes in procurement patterns, noting when a facility that had been dormant for months suddenly shows increased vehicle activity, watching for the movement of specific individuals between institutions. The people doing this work would have had no idea when, or whether, their analysis would ever be acted upon. They were building a picture for a decision that might or might not ever be made. And then one day, a war started, and the decision was made. And 30 years of careful concealment on one side met years of careful intelligence work on the other. And the factories that had operated under the apparent protection of civilian camouflage for 3 decades were gone in a matter of days. Now step back and look at the full strategic picture. because what happened in Tehran carries implications that reach far beyond this specific conflict and this specific weapons program. For 3 decades, Iran operated on a strategic assumption that hiding military infrastructure inside a densely populated capital city provided something close to permanent protection. The assumption was that the political cost, the moral complexity, and the international pressure associated with striking targets, surrounded by millions of civilians, would always outweigh whatever military value the targets represented. That the calculus would never shift far enough in any adversary's favor to justify actually hitting those facilities. That assumption was not foolish when it was made. It reflected a genuine understanding of how international pressure and political constraints have historically limited military operations. Most of the time, that kind of calculation holds. Most governments, most of the time, do not strike targets embedded this deeply in civilian populations. But here is what Iran's 30-year bet ultimately rested on: the assumption that most of the time meant always, that the protection civilian camouflage provided was permanent rather than conditional, that the threshold would never be crossed. It was crossed, and the moment it was crossed, the protection that had held for 30 years disappeared almost instantly, not gradually, not with a warning that gave Iran time to relocate its infrastructure. Instantly, once the decision was made that the value of destroying the production capability outweighed the cost of the strikes. Every government watching this conflict, and they are all watching closely, has now seen a 30-year concealment strategy fail at the moment an adversary decided it was finally worth the cost of acting on the intelligence they already had. That is the lesson that doesn't make the headline, but carries the most weight in the months and years that follow. The governments most interested in that lesson are not necessarily the ones making public statements about it. They are the ones quietly reviewing their own arrangements, their own dispersal strategies, their own reliance on civilian camouflage as a passive shield, their own confidence that an adversary has not already mapped what they believe remains hidden. Because the uncomfortable implication of Tehran is this: the gap between what a government believes is secret and what its adversaries have already found can be enormous, and can remain enormous for decades, right up until the moment someone decides to act on what they know. Iran believed for 30 years that the location of its most sensitive production facilities was either unknown or untargetable. The evidence suggests it may have been neither. The intelligence was apparently assembled. The target list was apparently built. The decision simply hadn't been made yet, until it was. That realization, that the protection offered by secrecy is conditional on your adversary choosing not to act, is a fundamentally different security environment than the one Iran thought it was operating in. And it is a different environment than any government relying on similar strategies is now operating in. What happened in Tehran's industrial districts is, on one level, a story about missile factories and airstrikes in the fog of a specific regional war. But underneath that immediate story is something that will shape how militaries, intelligence agencies, and governments think about weapons concealment and civilian camouflage for the next generation. A program built over 30 years, backed by foreign expertise, layered behind front companies and bureaucratic shells, physically hidden inside the most densely populated city in the country, protected by the seemingly permanent assumption that the civilian cost of striking it would always be too high. All of it assembled, all of it mapped, all of it struck within the opening days of a conflict that changed the rules of engagement in ways few had anticipated. The factories are gone. The engineers who built them are scattered. The training institutions that produced the next generation of engineers were struck. The command structures that would have directed the weapons produced there were targeted. And 30 years of a strategy that worked almost perfectly right, up until it suddenly didn't, has now become the defining case study of how civilian camouflage fails, when the calculation on the other side finally shifts. There was no single warning bell that told Tehran its 30-year bet had an expiration date. There was simply a quiet, patient accumulation of intelligence work on the other side of the equation, year after year, until one day the picture was complete and the decision was made. And then the factories that a city of 9 million people didn't know were sitting in their neighborhoods were gone. And the world that had watched Tehran for 3 decades without fully understanding what it was looking at was left to reckon with what that means. For this conflict, for the region, and for every government anywhere that still believes hiding weapons, programs inside civilian life is a strategy that lasts forever. It lasted 30 years in Tehran. Then it didn't. If this video reshaped how you understand where modern weapons programs actually hide, and what it takes to find them, share it somewhere specific right now. Not just a deliberate share to a place where people who care about understanding this region are actually having the conversation. A forum, a thread, a group where this analysis will land in front of someone who needs it. That's how this channel reaches the people it's built for. Share it, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you when the next chapter of this story breaks.